Welcome back. This time we are going to be talking about EQ. What is EQ? How does it work? Why are there so many different kinds? How does it apply to mixing in music production? So EQ, what does it stand for? EQ is just short for equalization, which basically just means to balance something. Balance an audio signal, to equalize it, to make it sound right maybe, or just to give you some control over it. That's basically what EQ is. It gives you control tonally over an audio signal. You've probably experienced it, whether it's on your phone, your iPod, your hi-fi, whatever. You have control sometimes for tone. Sometimes it's a graphic equalizer. That's just another version of EQ. Or sometimes you just have high and low, and it's adjusting the sound. So in mixing, you need very large amounts of control over all the sounds in the mix to make them fit together, so that they don't stack up and become crowded and create a muddy, unlistenable mix. So therefore, we have EQ. Now, EQ has been around since recording music has been around, and it's become more sophisticated. Analog EQ on mixing desks, like what I learned on, was something you grabbed and controlled with your hands, and you used your ears to hear what you were doing. These days, plugins, it happens on the screen, and to a certain extent you can see what you're doing, but we'll talk about that more later. So how does EQ work? What are the different kinds? Basically, professional EQ that you would find on a mixing desk, or an external EQ, like I've got some over there, or even on a plugin, you basically have 4 bands. What is a band? So it's a frequency band. So let's say any particular sound can be split up into 4 frequency bands. So if this is the whole thing, then you've got the highs, the high mids, the low mids, and the lows. And it gives you control over each of those sections separately. So for each of those 4 bands, you will normally have 3 controls. They are frequency, so selecting the actual frequency you want to be able to manipulate. Then gain, whether you want to boost or cut that frequency, turn it down or turn it up basically. And the third control is called Q, or width, which basically means how wide do you want that cut or boost to be. So if you can imagine boosting EQ as like a bell shape. So a flat EQ is a flat line. When you boost it, it boosts it or cuts it in a bell shape. How wide is that? That's what width is. So let's say I wanted to boost 5K. If I've got a very wide setting on my Q, when I boost 5K, I'm also boosting 4K, 3K, I'm also boosting 6, 7. So that's what the width does. It affects how wide that cut or boost is. And the effect of that is that very wide cuts or boosts, as long as they're fairly subtle, sound very natural. They don't sound unnatural. They don't sound like you're completely changing the sound of whatever that instrument or whatever that sound is. When you start to really narrow the Q, really make it a very, unwide cut or boost, like a spike if you could see it on a graph, and then you boost or cut, that sounds very unnatural. And there are reasons you would do that. Generally, it's to get rid of problems. It's not many times you would boost, but quite often you would cut in a notch to get rid of issues with an audio signal. So you've got those 4 bands. You can select a frequency, decide whether you're going to boost it or cut it, and then decide how wide that cut or boost is going to be. And then by adjusting all of those together, you have sort of controlled that frequency. You have balanced it, you have equalized it. The other controls you will quite often find on EQ is 2 filters. So these are either called high cut and low cut, or high pass and low pass. Basically the same thing. Slightly different, but basically the same thing. So let's look at the high cut or the low pass. That would normally start at 20 kilohertz, sort of the top end of like EQ quite often, not always, but quite often, and allow you to get rid of all the frequencies up to, or everything below a certain frequency is allowed to continue to be heard, but everything above that would be cut off. So let's say if I wound my low pass or my high cut down to 12K, everything above 12K is gone. You can't hear that anymore. Why would you do that? Well, sometimes you might have something that's got a lot of hiss on it, a lot of noise, and that's going to be right up the top end a lot of the time. So you could use that to get rid of that. Sometimes some things are just too bright. You need to sort of back them off a bit. So you'd use that for that, possibly. And it's the same at the other end, the low cut or the high pass. So that works exactly the same, but on the other end of the frequency spectrum, down at the really low end. So let's say you're mixing a vocal and you've recorded it without any filters, and I don't know, bus went past where you're recording the vocal, or there was some rumble from the floor going up through the mic stand while they were moving around, while they were doing their performance. That low end rumble is going to be in the recording. You might not always hear it, but it might trigger a compressor, it might cause issues. So you do what's called rolling it off, and you would use the low cut or the high pass for that. So you'd set it maybe like 80 hertz, 90 hertz, maybe 100 hertz, and everything below that is gone. Now there's always like a slope, so it wouldn't just cut off at 90 or whatever you set it at, it would slowly roll off. So at 90 it would start to be less coming through, 80 even less, 70 even less. Sometimes you can adjust how steep that slope is, sometimes you can't, depends on the EQ. So you've got your 4 bands with your 3 controls. So you've got 4 bands, each with frequency select, cut or boost, the gain, and the width, also known as the Q. Then you've got your 2 filters. Sometimes you can select how the EQ works, in that not all the time does it work in like a bell shape. So you don't just have a width control and that's it. Sometimes, quite often, just at the top and the bottom, so for the high and the low EQ, you would be able to select that to become a shelving EQ. Now a shelving EQ sort of does what it says. So instead of allowing you to boost at say 5 kilohertz at the top end, or 10 kilohertz at the top end, and affect things in like a bell shape either side of it, the shelving EQ basically, let's say if I set it at 5k, everything from 5k upwards is boosted by the same amount all the way to the end of the spectrum. And you can have those for low EQ as well. Sometimes that's really useful. I don't know, if you're processing something, it's just a very dull sound, it needs a bit of life in it. You pick a frequency like 8k maybe, and just boost everything above that, maybe just 1 or 2 dB, and that would really bring it alive. And it saves you having to, you know, sort of push a wide bell shape high end, which would do a similar job, but it would roll off again. So this goes all the way to the end of the frequency spectrum. So look out for that. So basically when you're mixing, you're going to have 4 frequency bands, each with 3 controls. Sometimes the high and low, you can switch between a bell shape and a shelf. And then you've got your filters, one at the top, one at the bottom. That is professional parametric EQ. Now they come in hardware units, they come on mixing desks, and obviously plugins. What are the different kinds of hardware, and why do people use different EQs for different things? Well, for myself, for example, I learned to mix on a SSL E series, and the EQ on those is sort of thought to be quite harsh and quite precise and clinical, which it is, and I'm a big fan of it. You can basically very easily zero in on the area you want to work on and do whatever you want to do to it, and it does it very well. I understand what they mean. It's not a particularly warm sounding EQ, but I think it's a very good sounding EQ. I really like it. Other people prefer Neve EQ. It's a slightly different beast. It's warmer, it's more subtle, it's not quite as scratchy maybe. I don't like that term scratchy for SSL because I really like it, but yeah, Neve EQ is warmer, it sounds nicer. People will prefer it quite often on vocals and prefer it on strings and things that need warmth and, you know, and subtlety. Then you've got things like the Pultecs. The Pultecs are interesting because they just work very differently from parametric EQs in the, so like on the EQ1 there's you select the frequency, you can select the width, but you can cut and boost at the same time, separate controls for cut and boost. So you can pick a frequency, cut 1 dB off it, but also boost 1 dB on the same frequency. Now you might think, well, that's just cancelled itself out. It sort of has, but it does a weird psychoacoustic thing, which I really like on vocals, so I quite often do that. Then you've got things like stereo EQs, which you would put over a bus or sometimes over the master output. Things like the Massenburg. I mean, I love the GML EQ. They're, you know, amazing things. A lot of people use them, as I say, for buses or for master buses, and they're just beautiful sounding. You do have to be careful with the older ones because sometimes left and right don't sound the same. But they're great. I used it on a guitar bus on an album I mixed not long ago, and it just made everything sound amazing. The other interesting thing about that unit is that I've run audio through it before with everything set to 0. It just sounds better. Don't know why, it's just one of those old analog units where there is some very subtle harmonic distortion going on there that just sounds nice. So different EQs for different jobs, different manufacturers just have slightly different takes on it. As you use more, you will start to notice that some work on certain instruments better than others. But basically they can all do very much the same job, and the EQ plugins that come with most digital workstations are more than good enough to do pretty much anything. And these days you don't just get one. There's normally a range of different EQs that you can pick from to use for different instruments. So I'm going to show you some examples in a minute. I'm just going to explain one thing you have to be careful when using plugins as opposed to mixing on a real analog EQ. When you're mixing on a mixing desk with analog EQ, the reason you know that what you're doing is working is because you can hear it. You make an adjustment, you hear it. If it's not right, you make a slightly different adjustment. You change what you've done. With a plugin, too many people rely on the graphic interface because it shows you an EQ curve of what you're doing. Lots of people will rattle through and set up an EQ for everything in their mix before they've pressed play. Now I know if you get to know something very well, sometimes you can give yourself a head start by doing that, but it's really bad practice to EQ with your eyes. This job is all about using your ears. Sound engineers have to develop really good hearing that they can trust. It's not about looking, and a lot of the time those graphic interfaces aren't particularly accurate, and quite often they use different scales. So, you know, just looking and saying, oh, that's the shape I normally put in for a kick drum, it ain't going to be the same from one plugin to the next. So try and use your ears, try not to look too much at what the screen's doing. It will mislead you and you won't learn what sounds good. You'll be misled by what you're looking at. You know, and quite often they have an analyzer built into them, and I'm not sure they're particularly accurate sometimes. I try not to look too much. Unless you're having real issues, sometimes they can help you, but use your ears. That's the best advice I can give you about EQ. And less is more. Generally, EQ is there to fix problems. Yes, you can use it creatively to do interesting things, but a lot of the time it's there to fix problems. And sort of the most common problems are cluttered mixes. And, you know, the low mid area is famous for just filling up with mud, and you know, sometimes you have to cut chunks out of things, which might sound unnatural on their own. That's another really good tip. When you're mixing, if you EQ something in isolation, so if you solo the bass guitar and EQ it, and then you put it back in the mix, you're like, oh, that sounded great on its own, doesn't sound so great in the mix. So be careful. Always EQ things in context. EQ them within the mix so that you can hear what they're doing. And also watch out for clashing. So it's very easy when you start mixing to boost the frequencies that sound nice. You know, so like a vocal will sound more exciting when you push sort of 2.5, 3K, but so will an electric guitar, and so will a snare, and so will a synth. So it's like, do we boost everything at the same frequency? No, because the mix will just become so cluttered and so painful to listen to that it won't work. So you have to be careful. It's called spectral mixing if you do that too much and you just assign everything a frequency. But to a certain extent, that is mixing. Making sure things don't clash, giving things room. And don't feel the need to EQ everything. If you've got something in your mix that just sounds great and there's no EQ on it, leave it alone. You're only going to make it worse. I think I learned very quickly when I used to do mixing sessions years and years ago that I would get carried away and feel I would start at channel 1, you know, track 1 on the tape machine, and work through a mix and EQ everything, and then listen to it all back and wonder why it sounded worse. It's because I'd EQ'd everything, because I thought I could make everything sound better, but I didn't. Everything on its own might have sounded more impressive, but when I put it all together, it just sounded like a mess. So don't rely on EQ, use it to fix issues. All right, I hope that helps. Anyway, I'm going to show you some examples and we can work through all that, and hopefully you'll learn how to EQ stuff. Okay, well here we are, back in a Logic session. This carries on from where we got to last time with the compression tutorial, so if you haven't seen that yet, go and find it on the channel, watch that first, because basically we're picking up where we left off. So we've got a very small little arrangement here of some Apple loops we've put together, and I've already compressed everything. Now obviously there's always an argument whether you should compress or EQ first. It doesn't matter, it depends what you're trying to do. There's no hard and fast rule. Generally I'll compress first and then EQ later, which is what we're going to do here. but you can just as easily do it the other way round. Difference is if you EQ first and then compress afterwards, the EQ, if it's before the compressor, will change how the compressor reacts. So you have to constantly change how you're going to compress it depending on if you go back and change your EQ. In this case, it doesn't affect it. The EQ is coming after the compression. So we're going to start with the drums again. Let's listen to the drums. They've just been compressed, nothing else. So there you go again, it's just an Apple loop. Obviously, if you're mixing a live drum kit or even if you're working with samples, sometimes you would have a separate channel for kick, snare, hat, the toms, whatever percussion sounds you're using, cymbals, room mics. And each of those would need EQing separately. In this case, it's just a stereo drum loop. Generally, that's when you're starting off what you're going to use to make tracks. So I've just imported one of those from Apple loops. So let's fire up an EQ. This is just the regular Logic EQ that comes free with Logic. So at the moment, everything's set flat. So when we play it, it should sound exactly the same. Which it does. So what I want to do to that drum track? Well, what I'd really like to do is give it a bit more oomph down the bottom. I'd like the kick to be a bit stronger, and I'd like the snare to have a little bit more snap on it. First thing I'm going to do though is I'm going to roll off a bit of the bottom using a low cut or a high pass filter, just because there is some stuff floating around way down low which I don't need. So I'm going to roll that off at about 39 Hertz. It's going to slope off, so it's not going to suddenly cut off at 39, but it will tail off quite quickly after that. That gets rid of any low end stuff that's just going to get in the way. So now I've got to find a frequency that I want to push in order to give that kick a bit more oomph. Now I know it's going to be around 80, somewhere around there, so let's have a listen. So there you go, 82 Hertz. I've only pushed it a little bit, it's 2 dB push. I might give it a bit more than that. I've chosen just a regular bell, not the shelving filter, because if I'd have done the shelving shape, it would have pushed everything below that, which I don't want to do. I just want to affect that sort of relatively narrow frequency band. You can see that the shape is, it's affecting right up to 200, so it's quite wide, but that will sound natural, and that's fine. There's nothing else there that's going to bug me. So yeah, 2.5 dB push at 82 Hertz. Turn it off. Now I'll turn it on. Listen to the difference in the kick. And on. So that kick has got a lot more punch now. So the snare, let's see if we can find that. Now you can see I narrowed the Q, so all of a sudden quite big boosts starting to sound quite unnatural. But I'm doing that on purpose to find the frequency. It's quite a good technique to just move it around, hear the frequency that you want to adjust, and then do it sensibly. So I'll show you what I mean. Okay, so I think that's doing what I want it to do. I'm just going to turn it off and then turn it on after a few seconds so you can hear the difference. So this is without. Now I'm going to turn it on. I might push a shelving EQ right at the top end just a little bit, just to help those hi-hats. Just 1 dB. Turning it off and on. So I think that's a good starting point, but I'm going to put in the bass and the guitar and come back to it and listen to it again in context, because that snare at the moment does sound a little bit unnatural, but I think that's going to be right once everything's in, but I could be wrong. But the next thing I have to do is have a listen to the other drum track. So what I did a parallel drum track, exactly the same loop, but I went a bit mad. I put a massive reverb on it and then compressed after that, but a massively, real big squeeze, like a 30-to-1 compressor. So it sounds like this on its own, which is not very nice. So you can hear that's just a kind of a bit of a crazy drum sound which wouldn't really work in its own right. But when you put it with the main drum sound, it sounds a lot more exciting. If I turn it off, drums have gone quite boring again, put it back in. But I can hear a problem with it, and the problem is that massive compressor and the reverb are doing something very strange to the hi-hats, which I really want to get rid of. So I'm going to fire up, this is a Logic EQ as well, it's one of the vintage EQs you get free with it. It's supposed to be an API graphic, which is great because that's perfect for this job. So I'm just going to mute the other drums, so I'm only listening to this parallel drum, and I'm going to basically try and get rid of those. It's kind of like a wavering hi-hat sound because the compressor's sort of really pumping. It's making the hi-hat sound strange, so I'm going to try and get rid of that. So there it is, it's kind of, so that's a lot better. It was in the 8K, I've also taken out some 16 as well. If I play it with, so the hi-hat's almost disappeared, it's there a bit but not much. If I turn the EQ off, you can hear it. I might do something with the low mid. Let me just listen to both the drums together. So there is a little bit of sort of clunkiness, a little bit of muddiness. It might even be a little bit of phasing going on in the low mid. So I'm going to just try and pull out a little bit 250 and see if that helps it. Yeah, I quite like that. Let me try a little push as well. The bottom of the snare's got a nice snap now, but I'd quite like it to have more body, and that's a bit lower down. So let me try and find that. Okay, happy with that. Drums sounding good to me. Let's move on before we come back and have another look once we can hear it in context. Okay, so let's have a look at the bass. Let's fire up an EQ, just a regular Logic channel EQ. It's all flat, so it shouldn't do anything. Let's start by finding that frequency where the real top end is, where we can hear the fingers playing on the strings. So that's quite a big boost there, but it has brought it out a lot. We'll have to see whether that's still working when everything else is in, but at the moment that sounds how I want it to sound. Now I want to try and make a bit of a gap for the kick. So it's just over 100 Hertz. It's quite wide at the moment. I'm going to see if I can narrow it. So it's bang on 100 Hertz. I've narrowed it a bit. It's not doing too much damage to the sound of the bass guitar itself, but it has left a little bit of a gap for the kick to really come through, which is what I want. Now I'm going to push a little bit at the bottom end just to give it a little bit more welly. So I've just used the Shelving EQ, 74 Hertz, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to add a high pass filter. Because the Shelving EQ is running all the way down, that's pushing things way down low. I don't want them there, they're going to get in the way. So I'm just going to roll that up to 30 Hertz. I think that will probably turn it off and on again just to make sure. I'm pretty happy with that. Just turn the EQ off the bass. I think we can do it more with the top end. That's better. Okay, I'm happy with the bass. Now, let's unmute the guitar and see how that sounds. I'd say the guitar sounds a little dull, but we don't want to fall into the trap of boosting everything and cutting all in the same places. So let's fire up an EQ. This time I'm going to use another one of the vintage console EQs. This one is supposed to be the Neve EQ by the look of it. And it gives us less to work with, but it should be a nicer, smoother sound, and I don't want to do anything too sort of spiky or sort of scratchy with the guitar. I want it to sound smooth. It's already quite a staccato kind of piece anyway, so let's see what we can do, see if we can improve it, make it fit better. Now that's quite subtle, but I think you can hear it if I play it on its own. This is without EQ. Now I'm going to put it in. So it's a little bit brighter, but I've taken, what have I taken out? 176 Hertz, so just below 200 Hertz. I've taken some mud out just to free up that low mid, to stop it clogging up. I've also put a low cut high pass filter on at 50 Hertz. Again, nothing down there in that guitar sound I need to hear. So I'm quite happy with that. What I did this time is that I added a vocal. It's just a couple of vocal samples from Logic. I've put them in and we're going to do a couple of things. We're going to EQ them. I've already compressed it. We're going to EQ it to make it fit in with what we've done already. And we're going to add some reverb and delay just because the vocal will sound very dry and harsh otherwise. Let's have a listen to see how that sounds with our mix we've got already. Okay, sounds okay, but it's not really sitting proud, it's not really sort of hitting me the way I want it to. It's the vocal, after all, it's supposed to be the main element here. So let's give it some more excitement, let's give it some more body. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put a high pass on it. This has probably been done because it's a sample, but I'm guessing I could roll off everything below about 90 and there'll be absolutely no loss at all, and I'm sure it'll sound the same. Tell me what you are. So that's made no difference, but obviously if there are some stray frequencies down there, that gets rid of them. So what I really want to do is give it a little bit of excitement, but also a bit more body. So I'm going to push a little bit, really wide for now, at about 2.5K. Let's have a listen.
Tell me what you are going through. Tell me what you are gonna do. I don't know. Tell me what you are going through.
I think that sounds okay. What do I mean by body? There's an area of the vocal spectrum, especially sort of around below 1K, 700-ish sometimes. It just thickens it up. It's a really nice frequency to sort of help a vocal sound thicker.
Tell me what you are going through. Tell me what.
When you listen to it, it actually resonates here at the top of your chest, and that's kind of a giveaway as to what it's doing.
Tell me what you are going through. Tell me what you are gonna do. I don't know. Tell me what you are going through. Tell me what you are gonna do. I don't know.
Okay, I quite like that. Let's listen to it without.
Tell me what you are going through.
Same line with EQ.
Tell me what you are going through. Tell me what you are gonna do.
Okay, now I'm just going to put a very basic reverb and sort of quarter delay on it just to make it bed in with the track.
Tell me what you are going through. Tell me what you are gonna do. I don't know. Tell me what you are going through. Tell me what you are gonna.
I think that sounds pretty good, and it's you know, it's just a bit of basic compression EQ. I've literally put a little reverb and delay on the vocal, and that's it. Obviously you could do a lot more, but I think that sounds pretty good. So let's listen to it once through, and then I'll turn all the EQ off and we'll see how different it sounds.
Tell me what you are going through. Tell me what you are gonna do. I don't know.
Okay, so all the EQs are going off. We're going to leave the compressor on and the reverbs and stuff, and let's have a listen.
Tell me what you are going through. Tell me what you are gonna do. I don't know. Tell me what you are going through. Tell me what you are gonna do. I don't know.
Might not be so easy to hear where you are, but through my studio monitors, that has got a lot more sort of resonance. It's hitting me in the chest a bit. It's just generally a little bit nicer. And obviously in a real mix, there would be a lot more channels, a lot more going on. And all these subtle changes would really give it space and allow you to hear all the various different instruments in the mix. Given more time, I might have another play with that bass guitar, do a bit more work on it. But generally, I think that sounds pretty good. So there you go, that's EQ, that's the basics of it. Hopefully you understood that. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Give me a like, subscribe if you want to see more, and we'll be back really soon with more of these. Thanks a lot, see you later.